The emergency beacon had been screaming into the void for 3 weeks before anyone bothered to investigate, and most salvage crews had written it off as another Zenthari trap, because the insect-like aliens were known for leaving damaged ships as bait for pirates and scavengers. But Captain Lisa Martinez was not most salvage crews, and she had 2 advantages that nobody else in human space possessed. The first advantage sat on her left shoulder, and his name was Spark, and he was a crystalline dragon no bigger than a cat, with scales that shifted between blue and purple depending on his mood. And right now those scales crackled with tiny arcs of electricity because he sensed something interesting ahead. And the second advantage perched on her right shoulder, and her name was Frost, and she was slightly larger than her brother, with scales like frozen starlight, and she exhaled small puffs of mist that frosted the air around her delicate snout. Lisa stood on the bridge of her salvage ship, the Wandering Star, and watched the wreckage grow larger on the view screen, and the Zenthari warship tumbled slowly through space like a drunk dancer. And it was massive, at least 3 times the size of her vessel, and scorch marks covered its hull where the reactor breach had burned through the outer plating, and escape pods dotted the surrounding space like scattered seeds, telling the story of a crew that had abandoned ship in a hurry. Her first officer, Danny Kim, whistled low and shook his head as he studied the scanner readings, and he said, "Boss, this thing is hot with radiation, and not the good kind. And the reactor core is still putting out enough energy to cook us if we get too close, and maybe we should call this one in and let the military handle it." But Lisa just smiled because she had dealt with worse, and besides, the military would just blow it up and waste all that beautiful technology. The dragon seemed to disagree with Danny's assessment, and Spark chittered excitedly and sent a small bolt of electricity dancing across the control panel, and Frost bumped her head against Lisa's cheek, and what the captain had learned was the dragon equivalent of saying, "Trust me, this is safe." And after 3 years of working with the crystalline pair, Lisa had learned to trust their instincts because they could sense things that human instruments missed. The Zenthari had made first contact with humanity 5 years ago, and the meeting had been awkward because the insect-like aliens found human biology disgusting, and humans found Zenthari social structure confusing, and the Council of Species had mediated the introduction and assigned humanity a provisional membership in galactic society with all the restrictions and none of the benefits, and most aliens still treated humans like primitive children who had barely learned to leave their cradle world. But humans had something that most galactic species had lost over millennia of soft living, and that something was the ability to look at broken things and see potential instead of garbage. And Lisa had built her entire career on that principle, and she had started with a broken transport shuttle that everyone said would never fly again, and now she owned a fleet of 3 salvage vessels and had a reputation for taking on jobs that made other captains run away. The approach took 2 hours of careful maneuvering because the Zenthari ship's gravity well was fluctuating wildly, and Danny had to adjust their course 17 times to avoid getting pulled into a collision. And the closer they got, the more details emerged on their scanners, and the warship had been beautiful once, with elegant curves and weapon ports that spoke of deadly efficiency, but now it looked like a victim of its own technology. And the reactor breach had gutted the engineering section and left the rest of the ship in uncertain condition. Spark and Frost became more animated as they approached, and the 2 dragons began to glow softly, and Spark's electricity flickered across his scales in complex patterns, while Frost's breath came out in geometric ice crystals that dissolved before they could touch anything. And Lisa had seen this behavior before, and it meant the dragons were analyzing something beyond human perception and communicating with each other in ways that even the smartest scientists couldn't explain. The crystalline dragons were a mystery that humanity had discovered on the 4th colony world, and they had appeared one day in the mountains and bonded with certain humans for reasons nobody understood, and attempts to study them had failed because the dragons simply teleported away when scientists got too pushy, and Lisa had been bonded to Spark and Frost since they were hatchlings no bigger than her thumb, and now they were her partners in every sense of the word. The docking procedure was tricky because the Zenthari airlocks were designed for creatures with 6 limbs instead of 4, and the standard human docking collar didn't quite fit. But Danny managed to rig an adapter using spare parts and some creative welding, and when the seal finally locked into place with a hiss of equalizing pressure, Lisa felt a familiar thrill run through her body, because this was the moment she lived for and the moment when she would step into the unknown and see what treasures or dangers waited inside. Her crew assembled in the cargo bay, and there were only 5 of them because salvage work was dangerous and Lisa preferred small teams where everyone knew their job and could trust each other without question. And besides Spark and Frost, there was Danny on sensors and Katie Brooks, the engineer, who could fix anything with enough time and coffee, and Vincent Hayes on security, because sometimes salvage crews found unexpected guests aboard derelict ships. And finally, there was young Amy Russell, fresh out of trade school and eager to prove herself. On her first real salvage operation, they suited up in environment gear because the Xanthari atmosphere was different from human standard, and the radiation levels were concerning, and the suits were bulky and uncomfortable. But they beat dying from exposure, and Lisa checked everyone's seals twice because space didn't forgive careless mistakes. And Katie made a joke about looking like an overstuffed sausage, but her hands were steady as she loaded her toolkit, and Vincent tested his shock pistol and nodded to show he was ready. The airlock opened with a groan of protesting metal, and stale air rushed out carrying the smell of burned circuits and something else that Lisa couldn't identify. And the interior corridor beyond was dark, except for emergency lighting that flickered weakly and cast strange shadows on the alien architecture. And the walls were too smooth and curved at odd angles that made human eyes hurt if you looked too long, and gravity was present but felt wrong, like walking on a slope that wasn't actually there. Spark and Frost didn't wait for permission, and they launched themselves into the corridor, and their scales began to glow brighter, casting blue and white light that pushed back the shadows, and they flew ahead scanning for dangers, and Lisa watched them disappear around a corner before she stepped through the airlock herself and felt the weight of the dead ship settle around her like a heavy blanket, and she smiled, because this was going to be interesting. The corridor stretched ahead like the throat of some mechanical beast, and the walls pulsed with a faint bioluminescence that the Xanthari used instead of proper lighting, and Lisa's boots made soft clicking sounds on the deck plates as she led her team deeper into the ship, and behind her, she could hear Katie's breathing over the comm link, steady and calm, despite the radiation warnings that kept flashing on their suit displays. Spark returned first, and he landed on Lisa's shoulder and chittered urgently, and his scales had shifted to a deep red color, which meant he had found something important or dangerous or possibly both. And Frost appeared a moment later from a side passage, and she circled the team once before flying back, the way she had come, and her message was clear. "Follow me," and Lisa gestured for the others to stay alert as they changed direction. The ship's layout made no sense by human standards, and corridors branched at odd angles, and some passages were too small for suited humans while others were large enough to drive a truck through. And the Xanthari clearly thought about space differently than humans did, and they built their ships like hives with multiple levels connected by vertical shafts instead of simple decks and stairs, and it made navigation a nightmare. But Katie was mapping everything on her portable scanner and leaving electronic markers so they could find their way back. They found the first bodies in what looked like a medical bay, and 3 Xanthari lay on the floor, their insect bodies frozen in death, and their compound eyes had gone dull and milky, and Vincent checked them carefully with his scanner and reported no life signs and no obvious cause of death, and the bodies weren't burned or injured, and they had just stopped working like machines that had lost power. And Lisa felt a chill run down her spine because whatever had killed them had been fast and clean. Amy made a small sound of distress over the comm, and Lisa turned to see the young woman staring at the bodies, and her face was pale behind her helmet visor. And Lisa moved to her side and spoke quietly, saying, "The first body is always hard, but these people were already gone before we got here, and there's nothing we could have done." And Amy nodded and took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders, and Lisa felt a flash of pride, because the girl had spirit. The medical bay yielded some interesting finds, and Katie discovered several Xanthari data tablets still operational, and she downloaded their contents for later analysis, and Vincent found a weapons locker that had been left unsealed in the crew's haste to evacuate, and inside were several Xanthari shock rifles and some kind of grenade launcher, and he carefully removed the power cells before storing them in his pack, because alien weapons had a habit of exploding when handled by species they weren't designed for. Frost led them to the engineering section next, and the damage There was extensive, and the reactor chamber door had been blown off its hinges and lay twisted in the corridor. And scorch marks covered everything, and the metal had melted in places, creating strange sculptures of frozen destruction, and the radiation levels jumped significantly as they approached, and Lisa ordered everyone to check their suit integrity and move quickly because even their heavy shielding wouldn't protect them forever. The reactor itself was a marvel of alien engineering, and it sat in the center of a massive chamber suspended by magnetic fields and glowing with a sullen red light. And coolant lines dangled broken from the ceiling and dripped some kind of fluorescent fluid that pooled on the floor and hissed when it touched. Metal and Katie approached the reactor carefully, and her scanner was going crazy with readings, and she muttered to herself as she worked through the data. After 10 minutes of study, Katie looked up, and her voice over the comm was excited, and she said, "Captain, this reactor didn't fail, and it was shut down deliberately, and someone or something initiated an emergency stop, and all the safeties kicked in exactly as designed, and the Xanthari abandoned ship because they thought it was dying. But the reactor is just sleeping, and with the right commands we could wake it up again." Lisa felt her heart rate increase, because if Katie was right, then this wasn't a dead ship at all, and it was a salvageable vessel, and possibly the biggest prize she had ever found, and the Xanthari had written it off as a total loss. And under galactic salvage law, that meant finders keepers. And she could already imagine the look on the faces of the Galactic Council when a human crew brought a fully operational Xanthari warship into port. But first they needed to understand what had happened and why the Xanthari had panicked and abandoned a perfectly good ship, and Spark provided the answer when he flew to a secondary control panel and began tracing the circuits with small electrical pulses, and his scales flickered in a pattern that Lisa had learned meant he was reading data directly from the ship's systems. And after a moment he chittered and projected a holographic image from his scales. The image showed the reactor chamber 3 weeks ago, and Xanthari crew members worked at their stations and everything looked normal. Until suddenly the reactor's containment field fluctuated, and warning lights flashed red, and the crew panicked, and someone hit the emergency shutdown, and the reactor obediently went into sleep mode and started cooling down. But the Xanthari didn't understand human-style safety systems, and they saw the shutdown as a failure instead of a success, and they evacuated. Thinking the ship was going to explode, Lisa started laughing, and she couldn't help it, and the absurdity of the situation was overwhelming, and the Xanthari had abandoned a perfectly functional ship because they didn't understand that sometimes shutting down was the safest option, and humans had been building fail-safe systems into their technology since the Industrial Revolution, and the concept was second nature. But apparently the Xanthari built everything to run perfectly or not at all, and they had no middle ground. Katie was already making plans, and she pulled out a portable computer and began running simulations, and she said, "If we can bypass the lockouts and reset the safety protocols, then we can restart the reactor and bring the ship back to full power, and it will take some work, and we'll need to manufacture some adapter circuits because Xanthari technology doesn't play nice with human tools, but it's doable." And she looked at Lisa with a grin and added, "This is going to be fun." The next few hours were spent exploring the rest of the ship, and they found crew quarters that still held personal belongings, and a galley with food stores that were technically edible but smelled like rotting vegetables, and a bridge that was surprisingly intact. And the main view screen still worked and showed the stars wheeling slowly as the ship tumbled through space. And Vincent found the ship's logs and downloaded everything he could access. Emmy discovered something interesting in what appeared to be a cargo bay, and she called Lisa over and pointed to a row of storage containers, and she said, "Captain, these are marked as medical supplies, and if they're intact they could be worth a fortune, and Xanthari medicine was advanced beyond human capabilities, and their healing compounds could cure diseases that human doctors could only treat, and the black market value alone would pay for Lisa's entire salvage operation 10 times over." But Lisa had bigger plans, and she looked around the massive warship and saw not just a salvage prize, but an opportunity. And if they could get this ship operational, they could prove that humans weren't just primitive scavengers, and they were engineers and problem solvers, and they could take the galaxy's garbage and turn it into treasure. And the Galactic Council would have to take humanity seriously. Spark and Frost seemed to approve of her decision, and both dragons glowed brightly and flew a happy circle around. The cargo bay and their scales left trails of light in the air like tiny comets, and Lisa knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she had the best crew in human space, and 2 magical dragons, and a ship full of alien technology waiting to be understood. He activated her comm and called back to the wandering star, and Danny answered immediately, and she said, "Get me every engineer we have on retainer, and tell them to bring their tools and their creativity, and also contact the colony administration, and let them know we're going to need some supplies and a lot of power cables." And when Danny asked what for, Lisa smiled and said, "Because we're not salvaging this ship and we're stealing it." The engineering team arrived 3 days later, and they came in 2 transport shuttles loaded with equipment and supplies, and Lisa had called in every favor she had and recruited the best specialists in the sector, and there was Marcus Chen, who had once rebuilt a fusion reactor using parts from a coffee maker, and Nicole Park, who could hotwire anything with circuits, and Benjamin Cole, who spoke 6 alien languages and could read Zenthari technical manuals like bedtime stories Katie had spent those 3 days mapping every system on the ship, and she had created a detailed plan for the restart sequence, and the reactor was the heart of the problem, but it wasn't the only issue, and the life support systems were calibrated for Zenthari. Biology in the gravity plating was unstable, and the navigation computer was locked behind security protocols that required genetic verification from a Zenthari officer, and basically everything needed to be rebuilt, or bypassed, or convinced to work with human users. The first priority was power, and without the main reactor they were running on emergency batteries that wouldn't last another week, and Katie had decided to restart the reactor in stages, and first they would bring it up to 10% output, just enough to power essential systems, and then they would monitor for problems before increasing power gradually, and it was a cautious approach. But caution kept engineers alive. Spark and Frost had appointed themselves as quality control inspectors, and they flew through the engineering spaces and examined every connection and every bypass that the human team installed, and twice Spark had stopped work by landing on someone's hands and refusing to move until they fixed a mistake. And once Frost had frozen a power coupling that was overheating and saved them from a potentially dangerous surge, and the engineering team had learned to trust the dragon's instincts. The restart procedure began on day 6, and Katie stood at the main control panel with Benjamin translating the Zenthari readouts, and Lisa watched from a safe distance with her hand on the emergency shutdown that they had rigged as a backup, and Katie's voice was steady as she counted down and initiated the sequence, and for a long moment nothing happened. And then the reactor began to hum and the sound grew louder and deeper until Lisa could feel it in her bones. Power flooded through the ship like blood returning to a sleeping limb, and lights flickered on in corridors that had been dark for weeks, and the gravity plating stabilized, and suddenly everyone's feet were firmly on the deck instead of floating in the uncertain field, and environmental controls kicked in and began scrubbing the stale air and replacing it with something breathable, and the bridge displays came to life showing system status in alien script that Benjamin immediately began translating. The crew cheered and high-fived each other, and Katie pulled off her helmet and took a deep breath of the newly filtered air and grinned and said, "I told you it would work." And Marcus clapped her on the shoulder and said, "You're buying drinks when we get back to port." And even serious. Vincent cracked a smile, and Amy literally jumped for joy, and her feet left the deck for a moment before gravity pulled her back down. But the work had only begun, and bringing the reactor online was just the first step, and now they needed to make the ship functional for human use, and that meant rewiring life support and recalibrating sensors and figuring out how to interface human computers with Zenthari systems. And it was like trying to teach a cat to speak dog, and sometimes it felt impossible, but the team tackled each problem with stubborn determination. Nicole discovered that the Zenthari used a quantum-based computer system that made human binary processors look like Stone Age tools, and the processing power was incredible, but the operating system was designed for minds that thought in mathematical patterns instead of linear logic. And she spent 2 days just trying to figure out how to input basic commands. And finally, she gave up on understanding it, and just built a translation layer that converted human requests into Zenthari mathematics. The weapon systems were another challenge, and the ship had been armed with plasma cannons and missile launchers and some kind of beam weapon that the team couldn't identify, and Vincent examined everything carefully and reported that the weapons were offline and would require extensive work to make functional. But Lisa made the decision to leave them that way for now and said, "We're not trying to build a warship, and we're trying to get this bucket home, and we can worry about weapons later." Spark had other ideas, and the little dragon spent hours examining the beam weapon, and he seemed fascinated by its power crystals. And one day he simply climbed inside the housing and began rearranging components, and Lisa nearly had a heart attack and tried to pull him out. But Frost blocked her path and bumped her head against Lisa's hand in a gesture that meant, "Let him work." And when Spark finally emerged, the beam weapon powered up and fired a test shot that vaporized a piece of space debris 2 kilometers away. The dragons continued to surprise everyone, and Frost discovered that she could regulate the ship's temperature more efficiently than the environmental controls, and she would fly through the corridors breathing cold air into overheated sections and warmth into areas that were too cold. And the ship's computer recognized her as a legitimate system component and began routing temperature alerts to wherever she happened to be, and Spark did the same with electrical systems and became a living circuit breaker. On day 12, they attempted to fire up the main engines, and Marcus had rebuilt the control interface, and Nicole had convinced the navigation computer to accept human input, and Benjamin had translated all the safety protocols. And Katie hit the ignition sequence and held her breath, and the engines coughed and sputtered and then roared to life, and the whole ship shuddered and began to move, and for the first time in weeks, the dead Xanthari warship had power and propulsion and a human crew. The test flight was short and cautious, and they only traveled a few thousand kilometers before shutting down the engines. But it was enough to prove the concept, and Lisa stood on the bridge and watched the stars move past the view screen, and felt a sense of accomplishment that was hard to describe. And they had taken something broken and made it work, and they had succeeded where an entire alien species had failed, and it was a very human moment. But their success had not gone unnoticed, and on day 15, a Xanthari patrol ship appeared on their sensors, and the comm systems lit up with an incoming transmission. And Benjamin translated as, "The Xanthari commander demanded to know what humans were doing with Xanthari military property," and his tone was angry and suspicious. And Lisa could hear the insect-like clicking that underlay every Xanthari voice. Lisa replied calmly and explained that the ship had been abandoned and declared a total loss, and under galactic salvage law, it was now human property, and she had the documentation to prove it. And the Xanthari commander was silent for a long moment, and then he said that the ship contained classified technology and military secrets, and it should be destroyed, not salvaged. And Lisa felt a cold anger building in her chest. The conversation went back and forth, and the Xanthari commander became more aggressive and threatened to board the ship and seize it by force, and Lisa's crew gathered on the bridge, and their faces were tense, and Vincent checked his weapons, and Katie pulled up the defensive systems on her console, and even the dragons sensed the danger, and they perched on Lisa's shoulders with their scales glowing bright red. Then Lisa made a decision that would change everything, and she opened a channel to the Galactic Council headquarters and requested an emergency arbitration, and she broadcast on all frequencies so everyone in the sector could hear. And she stated clearly that humans had legally salvaged an abandoned vessel, and that the Xanthari were attempting to violate salvage law, and she demanded a ruling from the Council, and suddenly, the whole galaxy was watching. The Xanthari commander backed off, and his ship maintained a distance but didn't leave, and Lisa knew that the real battle had just begun, and it wouldn't be fought with weapons, but with words and laws and politics, and she smiled grimly because humans had been arguing and negotiating since the dawn of civilization. And if the Xanthari wanted a legal fight, then they had picked the wrong species, Spark, and Frost settled down on the command chair, and their scales gradually shifted back to calm blue and purple, and Lisa stroked their heads and said quietly, "We're not giving this up, and we earned this ship, and we're going to take it home." And the dragons purred in agreement, and the crew nodded, and they all knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The Galactic Council arbitration took 3 days to convene, and during that time Lisa's ship remained stationary, while the Xanthari patrol vessel circled like a hungry shark, and more ships began arriving from across the sector, and news crews, and curious observers, and even a few other salvage captains who wanted to see how this would play out. And the space around the disputed warship became crowded with vessels. Lisa used the time to prepare her case, and Benjamin helped her review every relevant salvage law and treaty provision. and Nicole pulled together documentation of every system they had repaired, and Katie created detailed technical reports showing that the Xanthari had abandoned a functional vessel, and Amy compiled a timeline of events with sensor logs and communication records, and it was more paperwork than Lisa had seen in her entire career. The dragons seemed to understand that something important was happening, and they stayed close to Lisa and rarely left her side. And Spark would occasionally fly circuits around the bridge as if checking for danger, and Frost spent hours lying across Lisa's lap while she worked, and the warmth from the dragon's crystalline body was comforting and helped Lisa focus on the massive task ahead. The arbitration hearing was held via holoconference because bringing everyone to a physical location would have taken weeks, and the council chambers appeared as a virtual space, and Lisa stood in a circle of light on her bridge, while holographic representatives of a dozen alien species materialized around her. And the arbiter was a Quillian named Seventh of Inquiry, and she was a floating mass of tentacles and crystalline thinking organs, and her voice sounded like wind chimes. The Xanthari presented their case first, and Commander Zekthar stood rigid in his holographic form, and his mandibles clicked aggressively as he spoke, and he argued that the warship contained classified military technology and that human possession of such technology violated several treaties. And furthermore, the ship had not been properly abandoned, and the crew had intended to return with proper equipment, and the humans had interfered with a legitimate military operation. Benjamin translated everything in real time and whispered additional context to Lisa about Xanthari legal concepts and body language. And the commander was lying about intending to return, and his pheromone signature indicated deception, and Lisa filed that information away for later use. When it was her turn to speak, Lisa kept her voice calm and professional, and she presented the timeline showing that the Xanthari had declared the ship a total loss in official communications and that the emergency beacon had been broadcasting for 3 weeks without any rescue attempt, and she played recordings of Xanthari command, ordering all vessels to avoid the wreck due to radiation danger, and she showed signed documents from the Xanthari themselves, declaring the ship beyond salvage. The arbiter's tentacles waved in what might have been interest or skepticism, and she asked why humans thought they could repair a vessel that the Xanthari had declared unrepairable, and Lisa smiled and said because we didn't know it was impossible. And she gestured to Katie, who presented the technical analysis showing that the reactor had functioned exactly as designed, and that the Xanthari had misunderstood their own safety systems. That revelation caused a stir among the assembled representatives, and several species began whispering among themselves, and the Xanthari commander's hologram flickered with what Benjamin identified as extreme embarrassment, and the translator struggled to convey the nuances. But essentially, Lisa had just proved that the Xanthari had panicked and abandoned a perfectly good ship because they didn't understand basic emergency protocols. The arbiter asked to see evidence of the repairs, and Lisa was ready for this, and she had Nicole present a virtual tour of the ship, showing every system they had modified and every bypass they had installed and every human addition to the alien technology, and it was clear that extensive work had been done, and that the humans had invested significant resources and expertise into making the vessel. Functional Commander Zekthar tried to argue that the modifications proved the humans intended to use the ship for military purposes, and that made them a threat to galactic security, and Lisa countered by pointing out that they had left most of the weapons offline and that the modifications were purely for life support and navigation and basic operations. And she said, "We just want to take this ship home and study it and maybe learn something, and that's not a crime." The hearing stretched on for hours, and various council members asked questions, and experts presented opinions, and legal scholars debated fine points of salvage law, and Lisa's feet hurt from standing, and she was getting tired, but she refused to show weakness, and beside her Spark and Frost remained alert, and their presence was oddly comforting, and several of the council representatives commented on the dragons and asked about their role. Lisa explained that the crystalline dragons were her partners, and that they had been instrumental in making the ship safe and functional, and she showed sensor logs of Spark detecting flawed circuits and Frost cooling overheated systems, and the arbiter seemed particularly interested in this and asked if the dragons were intelligent beings or trained animals, and Lisa said their family, and that seemed to satisfy the question. The turning point came when a representative from the Valorian collective asked a simple question, and she said if the Xanthari had declared the ship worthless and abandoned it to die in space, and then humans came along and fixed it and made it valuable again, and who had really created the value, and was it the Xanthari? Who built the original hull, or the humans who gave it new life? That question hung in the virtual chamber like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing, and Lisa saw several representatives nodding, and even the Arbiter's tentacles stilled as she considered the philosophical implications, and the truth was that the ship as it existed now was more human than Xanthari, and every critical system had been touched by human hands, and human ingenuity had transformed a dead hulk into a living vessel commander. Xekthar made one final argument, and he claimed that allowing humans to keep the ship would set a dangerous precedent, and that it would encourage other species to steal Xanthari technology by waiting for accidents and swooping in to claim salvage rights. And Lisa felt her patience snap, and she said, "You're not upset that we took your ship, and you're upset that we fixed it, and you're embarrassed that you gave up when you should have tried harder." The chamber went silent, and Lisa knew she had crossed a line, but she was tired of dancing around the truth, and she continued saying, "Humans don't give up on things just because they're hard, and we look at broken things and see possibilities, and maybe that makes us different, but it doesn't make us thieves. And this ship was garbage when we found it, and now it's treasure, and that transformation belongs to us." The Arbiter called for a recess, and Lisa's hologram winked out, and she found herself back on her bridge with her crew watching, and Katie gave her a thumbs up, and Vincent nodded approval, and Amy looked worried but supportive, and Danny called from the Wandering Star to say that the sector news feeds were going crazy, and that Lisa's speech was being replayed everywhere. 2 hours later, the Arbiter reconvened the hearing, and her verdict was measured and careful, and she stated that under galactic salvage law, the humans had legitimate claim to the vessel, and that the Xanthari had properly abandoned the ship through official declarations and emergency protocols, and that the extensive repairs and modifications performed by the humans had created new value that belonged to the salvage crew. However, the Arbiter added that the ship still contained Xanthari technology and design elements, and that the humans would be required to share technical documentation with the Council and submit to periodic inspections, and furthermore, the ship could not be used for military purposes without Council approval, and these conditions were non-negotiable. Lisa accepted the terms immediately, and she knew it was the best outcome she could hope for, and Commander Xekthar's hologram flickered with anger, but he had no grounds to appeal, and the ruling was final, and the hearing ended with the Arbiter pronouncing that the vessel now belonged to Captain Lisa Martinez and her crew under the name and registration of their choosing. As the holograms faded, Lisa looked around her bridge at the alien technology that was now legally hers, and she felt Spark and Frost press against her shoulders and heard her crew cheering and knew that they had just made history, and she activated the ship-wide comm and said, "Attention all hands, and welcome aboard the Phoenix, and let's take her home." The journey back to human space took 2 weeks, and during that time the Phoenix became more than just a salvaged ship, and it became a symbol and news of the human crew who had outsmarted the Xanthari and won a legal battle against a major galactic power. Spread across every communication network, and salvage crews celebrated in bars from the core worlds to the frontier, and even the Galactic Council members who had voted against Lisa found themselves impressed by human determination. The crew worked constantly to improve their new vessel, and Marcus discovered that the Xanthari had designed the ship with modular components that could be swapped out, and he began sketching plans for human-style living quarters that would be more comfortable than the sterile Xanthari chambers, and Nicole found that the quantum computer system could interface with human AI programs, and she started teaching the ship to understand human voice commands, and Benjamin translated the entire operations manual into English and added helpful notes like, "This button causes rapid decompression, so maybe don't press it, Spark." And Frost continued their role as ship guardians, and they had claimed the main engineering space as their territory and built a nest from fiber optic cables and crystalline insulators, and the engineers learned to work around them. And occasionally the dragons would bring them tools or point out problems, and Katie swore that Spark understood engineering better than most of her human crew, and she started asking his opinion on difficult repairs, and the little dragon would chirp and gesture with his wings, and somehow Katie always understood what he meant. The Phoenix arrived at New Haven Colony to a hero's welcome, and the Orbital station was decorated with lights and banners, and 300 ships had gathered to see the legendary salvaged warship. And Lisa brought the Phoenix in slowly, and she was still learning the ship's handling characteristics and the Zenthari. Controls were sensitive, and she nearly clipped a docking arm. But Vincent talked her through it, and they settled into dock with only minor scraping sounds. The colony administrator was a woman named Patricia Moore, and she came aboard personally to congratulate Lisa, and she walked through the corridors with wide eyes and said, "I heard the stories, but seeing it in person is incredible, and you really took a Zenthari warship and made it human." And Lisa laughed and said, "We made it better, and that's the important part." And Patricia agreed and offered the colony's full support for any future modifications. The media attention was overwhelming, and reporters from a dozen species wanted interviews, and Lisa's face appeared on news feeds across the galaxy, and some called her a genius and others called her a thief, and a few called her dangerous. But everyone agreed that she had changed the game, and humans were no longer seen as primitive newcomers, and they were problem solvers and innovators, and species that could turn garbage into treasure. The technical community was equally interested, and engineers and scientists requested permission to study the Phoenix, and Katie organized tours and started documenting their modifications, and she published several papers on human Zenthari interface protocols, and within months other salvage crews were using her techniques, and human ships began incorporating alien technology in ways that the original builders had never imagined. But success brought complications, and the Zenthari government officially protested the council's decision, and they claimed that humans had stolen military secrets and threatened sanctions and trade restrictions, and diplomatic meetings were held, and ambassadors exchanged carefully worded threats, and for a few tense weeks it seemed like the incident might damage human-Zenthari relations permanently. Lisa was called to testify before the Human Colonial Congress, and she traveled to Earth for the first time in 5 years and brought Spark and Frost with her, and the dragons caused a sensation in the capital, and politicians wanted photos with them, and Frost obligingly posed, while Spark stole a senator's glasses and flew around the chamber until Lisa coaxed him down with treats. The congressional hearing was more serious, and representatives grilled Lisa about her actions and asked if she had considered the diplomatic consequences and whether she had endangered humanity's position in the galactic community. And Lisa listened patiently and then said, "If we only do what other species expect, and then we'll always be followers, and we found something broken and we fixed it, and that's what humans do, and if the Zenthari are angry about that, then maybe they should try fixing their own problems." Her blunt response made headlines, and public opinion shifted strongly in her favor, and humans across the colonies rallied behind the Phoenix and its crew, and the congressional representatives recognized the political wins and voted to award Lisa and her crew the Colonial Medal of Achievement and to fund a new program for salvaging and adapting alien technology. And suddenly Lisa found herself not just a successful salvage captain, but a symbol of human capability. The Zenthari eventually backed down from their threats, and they couldn't afford to damage trade relations over a single ship. And privately, several Zenthari engineers contacted Katie and asked how she had solved various technical problems, and a few admitted that human approaches to problem-solving were interesting and worth studying. And slowly the two species began to develop a grudging respect. 6 months after the salvage operation, the Phoenix had been fully converted for human use, and the living quarters were comfortable, and the control systems were intuitive, and the weapon systems had been restored with council approval after pirates began targeting human colonies, and Lisa assembled a permanent crew, and they began taking contracts for protection and exploration, and the Phoenix earned a reputation as the toughest ship in human space. Other salvage crews started finding more alien wrecks and applying human engineering to fix them, and a new industry was born. And humans became known across the galaxy as the species that could repair anything and make it better. And alien governments started hiring human engineers to solve problems that their own experts had given up on, and humanity's economy boomed. Lisa received offers to sell the Phoenix for enormous sums, but she always refused. And the ship was more than valuable property, and it was proof that humans belonged in the galaxy, and that they brought something unique to the community of species. And besides, Spark and Frost had bonded with the vessel, and they refused to leave, and Lisa wouldn't abandon them. The dragons grew larger over time, and Spark was now the size of a large dog, and Frost had become even bigger, and their powers had expanded with their size, and Spark could now channel enough electricity to power entire ship systems. And Frost could create ice shields that deflected weapon fire. And the crew treated them as equals, and the dragons seemed content with their role as guardians of the Phoenix. 2 years after the salvage operation, Lisa was invited to address the full Galactic Council, and she stood before representatives of hundreds of species and talked about the importance of second chances and fixing broken things instead of throwing them away. And she argued that the galaxy needed species with different perspectives, and that human stubbornness and refusal to accept impossible was valuable. And several council members nodded, and even the Xanthari representative didn't object. The speech was well received and led to new opportunities, and humanity was offered full council membership with voting rights and access to restricted technologies, and trade agreements were signed, and human colonies expanded, and children grew up in a galaxy where humans were respected and valued. And it all traced back to one salvage crew who had refused to accept that something was beyond saving. Lisa continued operating the Phoenix for many years, and she took on missions that other captains avoided and rescued, stranded vessels and fought pirates and explored unknown regions, and everywhere she went, Spark and Frost accompanied her, and their scales glowed bright in the darkness of space, and their legend grew until children across the galaxy knew the story of the crystalline dragons and their human captain. Eventually, Lisa retired, and she passed command of the Phoenix to Katie, who had earned her own captain's license, and the ship continued its work under new leadership. But the lesson remained, and humans had proved that broken things could be fixed, and that garbage could become treasure, and that sometimes the best solution to an impossible problem was to try anyway and refuse to give up. The Phoenix became a symbol that appeared on recruitment posters and inspired songs, and was studied in engineering schools across human space. And when people asked what made humanity special, the answer was always the same, and they pointed to a salvaged Xanthari warship crewed by humans and guarded by crystalline dragons, and said, "We're the species that fixes things, and we're the ones who see potential instead of problems, and that's why we belong among the stars." And somewhere in the depths of space, the Phoenix continued its journey with Spark and Frost flying ahead, and their scales painting light trails through the darkness, and behind them a crew of humans worked and laughed and solved impossible problems, and proved every day that nothing was truly broken, and everything deserved a second chance, and that was the most human thing of all.